They say hypothermia is peaceful, that the cold wraps around you like a blanket, that you simply drift away into sleep, that there's no pain in the end. They lied. Every nerve in my body screamed. Ice crystals formed in my lungs with each shallow breath. The zip ties cut deeper into my wrists with every involuntary shiver. And the snow, the beautiful silent snow that had always seemed so innocent in movies, pressed against my face like a frozen hand, trying to smother me. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, could hear it in my ears, each thud stretching longer like a clock running down. 60 beats per minute, then 50, then 40. This wasn't peaceful. This was drowning in ice. My last thought before the darkness started creeping in from the edges was simple and sharp as broken glass. Lillian. Who's going to save Lillian now? The fluorescent lights of Rosewood Diner buzzed with the kind of monotonous hum that became invisible after the first 100 hours of hearing it. Grace Winters had worked the night shift for 2 years. She knew every tick of the ancient wall clock, every crack in the vinyl booth seats, every weak floorboard that creaked under her weight when she carried trays of coffee and pie to customers who rarely looked at her face. She moved through the diner like background scenery. 24 years old, blonde hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail. Minimal makeup, black uniform that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft and thin. She refilled cups before they emptied, cleared plates before customers had to ask, anticipated needs before they became words. The dinner rush had ended hours ago. Now at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, the diner held only 4 customers. A truck driver at the counter nursing his 3rd coffee. An elderly woman in booth 3 who came every Tuesday and ordered the same chicken soup. And 3 men in the back corner booth who didn't belong here. Grace noticed them the moment they walked in. You learn to read people in this job. These men wore suits that cost more than Grace made in 6 months. Their shoes were Italian leather, spotless despite the slush and salt outside. They didn't look at menus, didn't make small talk, just ordered coffee black all 3 and waited until Grace had walked away before they started talking. She was refilling the truck driver's cup when she heard it. Ashford's territory. The voice was low, meant to stay contained within the curved walls of the booth. Friday shipment, Pier 9, 2 million clean. Grace's hand didn't shake. The coffee poured steady into the white ceramic mug, but something cold that had nothing to do with winter settled in her stomach. She'd heard that name before, Ashford, Dominic Ashford. In this city, you didn't need to read newspapers to know who ran things in the shadows. You just had to work night shifts and keep your ears open. Grace moved away from the counter toward the kitchen, her footsteps silent on the worn linoleum. Behind her, the conversation continued, voices slightly raised now that the waitress had disappeared from their awareness. Volkov won't move until we confirm the route is clean. It's clean. Ashford's been distracted. His lieutenant handles the details now. Which lieutenant? Brennan. Tyler Brennan. He's the weak link, ambitious, wants more than Ashford's willing to give. Grace pushed through the kitchen door. The sounds of the grill and the dishwasher swallowed the voices from booth 7. She leaned against the metal prep table, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tommy, the night cook, glanced at her. You okay, Grace? You look pale. Fine, she managed. Just tired. Just tired, just scared, just desperately, dangerously aware that she'd heard something that could get her killed. The shift ended at 2 in the morning. Grace hung up her apron, pulled on her threadbare winter coat, and stepped out into the kind of cold that bit through fabric and found bone. Snow had been falling since midnight, thick and steady, turning the city into something seen and muffled. Her apartment was 6 blocks away. She'd made this walk 1,000 times, even in winter. But tonight, every shadow felt like a threat. Every car that passed sent her heart rate spiking. She was being paranoid. The men in booth 7 hadn't even looked at her. To them, she was just the help, background noise, as forgettable as the buzzing fluorescent lights. Grace walked faster anyway. The apartment building was a pre-war walk-up with radiators that clanked and windows that let in drafts. Grace climbed 3 flights of stairs, her breath coming hard from exhaustion and cold. She unlocked the door quietly. Lillian would be sleeping and stepped into the tiny studio they called home. Except Lillian wasn't sleeping. Her sister sat in the worn armchair by the window, bathed in the pale glow of the dialysis machine. The machine hummed and clicked, pumping blood out of Lillian's body, filtering it, returning it through the catheter in her arm. 4 hours 3 times a week. 4 hours of sitting still while a machine did the work her kidneys could no longer manage. Lillian looked up when Grace entered. At 19, she should have been vibrant, full of energy, planning spring break trips and worrying about midterm exams. Instead, she was gray-skinned and hollow-eyed, her dark hair lank around her thin face. "You're late," Lillian said, but there was no accusation in it, just observation. "Busy night." Grace dropped her bag, shrugged off her coat. The apartment was cold. The heat had been turned down to save money. Everything was about saving money now. Grace crossed to the small kitchenette, started making tea. The ritual was soothing. Boil water. Steep the bags, pour into mismatched mugs, sit together in the quiet hours before dawn. "Dr. Morrison called again," Lillian said quietly. Grace's hand stilled on the kettle. "What did he say?" "Same thing as last time. 90 days, Grace. Maybe less. 90 days to find $180,000. 90 days to find a kidney donor and pay for the transplant surgery and the anti-rejection medications and the hospital stay and all the things that health insurance with a $5,000 deductible and a lifetime cap didn't cover. 90 days before her sister died. Grace brought the tea over, sat on the floor beside the armchair. She took Lillian's free hand, the one without the catheter, and held it gently. "We'll figure it out," Grace said. "How?" Lillian's voice cracked. "You work 80 hours a week already. We're drowning in medical bills. The GoFundMe barely raised $3,000. Grace, you can't—" "I'll figure it out," Grace repeated, firmer this time. "You're not dying. I won't let you." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "You can't control everything." But Grace had been controlling everything since she was 12 years old. Since their parents died in a car accident and the state tried to split them up, tried to put Lillian in a different foster home. Grace had fought, had lied about her age, had gotten emancipated at 16, had dropped out of high school to work full-time so they could stay together. She'd protected Lillian then. She'd protect her now, even if she had no idea how. After Lillian fell asleep, Grace sat alone in the dark apartment, staring at her phone. The conversation from Booth 7 played on repeat in her mind. Ashford's territory, Friday shipment, Pier 9, 2 million clean. Information like that had value. Grace knew people who knew people. There were journalists who paid for tips, private investigators. Maybe even the police, though Grace had learned young not to trust authority. $180,000. That number haunted every waking moment. Grace picked up her phone. It was an old model 3 generations behind current technology with a cracked screen she'd repaired with clear nail polish. But it still worked, and it had a voice recorder app. Her hands shook as she opened the app. This was insane, dangerous. The kind of decision that people made in movies right before everything went horribly wrong. But Lillian had 90 days. Grace activated the recorder, tested it. The playback was clear enough. If she kept the phone in her apron pocket, if she positioned herself close enough to conversations, if she was careful. She could gather information, build insurance. If something happened, if someone figured out what she'd heard, she'd have leverage, evidence, something to trade. Grace set the phone aside and buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room, to her parents, to Lillian, to the version of herself who still believed in playing by the rules. "I'm so sorry." But sorry didn't pay for kidney transplants. Sorry didn't keep sisters alive. The recording had become routine. Grace kept the phone tucked in her apron pocket, activated whenever the expensive suits appeared. They came regularly now, different faces, same pattern. Late nights, corner booths, quiet conversations about shipments and territories and money that moved in numbers Grace couldn't even conceptualize. She'd collected 14 days of audio, hours of conversations. Names she didn't recognize, places she'd never heard of, operations she didn't understand. Grace didn't listen to the recordings, didn't try to piece together the puzzle. That would make it real, would make her complicit. She was just gathering insurance, just protecting herself. That's what she told herself. It was 1:43 in the morning on a Saturday when Tyler Brennan walked into the diner alone. Grace recognized him immediately. He'd been part of a group that came in twice, always sitting with the other men in expensive suits. But tonight he was by himself. Tall, maybe 35, with the kind of build that came from gym memberships and protein shakes. His coat was open despite the freezing temperature outside, revealing an expensive watch and a silk shirt. He chose a booth, not the back corner one in the middle of the dining room where he could see the door, the windows, the entire space, where he could see Grace. She approached with her order pad, professional smile already in place. "Good evening. Coffee." Tyler looked up at her, and the smile that crossed his face made Grace's skin crawl. "You're Grace, right?" His voice was smooth, friendly. Too friendly. "You work the night shift pretty regularly." "Yes, sir. What can I get you?" "Just coffee. Black." He leaned back in the booth, studying her with eyes that saw too much. "You're a hard worker, I've noticed. Always here, always attentive. Most people don't pay attention to waitresses, but I do. I notice details." Grace's heart rate kicked up. "I'll get that coffee for you." She turned to walk away, but his voice followed her. "You're a good listener too, aren't you, Grace?" She froze just for a second, just long enough for the fear to spike cold and sharp in her chest. Then she kept walking, forcing herself to stay calm, stay professional, stay unnoticed. But when she returned with the coffee, Tyler's smile had changed. It wasn't friendly anymore, it was knowing, predatory. "You're always here," he said again, accepting the cup. "Always listening. That's a valuable skill, or a dangerous one, depending on perspective." Grace set the coffee down with steady hands. "Will there be anything else, sir?" "Not tonight." Tyler pulled out a $100 bill, set it on the table. "Keep the change, and Grace, be careful walking home. It's cold out there. Easy to get hurt when you're not paying attention." The bill sat on the table between them. The coffee was $3, $97 for a warning delivered with a smile. Grace took the money because refusing it would confirm his suspicions. "Thank you, sir. Have a good night." She walked away on legs that wanted to shake, cleared tables that didn't need clearing, refilled coffee cups that were still full. When she glanced back at Tyler's booth 10 minutes later, he was gone. The $100 bill felt like a brand in her pocket. Grace's shift ended at 2:30. She hung up her apron, checked her phone, no messages from Lillian, and pulled on her coat with numb fingers. The walk home had never felt longer. Snow fell in thick curtains, turning the world into a monochrome painting. Grace's footsteps crunched in fresh powder. The streets were empty. Even the bars had closed, sending their last patrons home to warm beds and safety. She was 2 blocks from her apartment when she heard the footsteps behind her. Grace walked faster. The footsteps matched her pace, 1 block. Her building was 1 block away. The footsteps got closer. Grace broke into a run. She made it half a block before hands grabbed her from behind. A bag went over her head. Rough fabric smelling of oil and fear. She tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth through the fabric, cutting off sound, cutting off air. "Stop fighting." Tyler Brennan's voice in her ear, calm and cold. "This'll be easier if you stop fighting." Grace fought anyway. Kicked back, connected with shin bone, heard a grunt of pain. But there were other hands now grabbing her arms, lifting her off her feet. She was thrown, literally thrown, into what felt like a car trunk. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. The lid slammed shut. Darkness, the rumble of an engine, movement. Grace sucked in breath through the bag still over her head, tasting oil and her own fear sweat. She tried to orient herself, but the trunk was small and she was folded awkwardly, hands already being pulled behind her back. The zip tie cut into her wrists with a sharp plastic bite. Tight. Too tight. Grace felt the circulation cut off immediately, felt her fingers start to tingle and then go numb. Nothing personal, sweetheart. Tyler's voice again muffled through the trunk's dividing wall. You heard names you shouldn't have. Heard details that weren't meant for Waitress ears. We can't have loose ends, you understand. Grace understood. She understood that she was going to die. The car drove for what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes. Grace tried to track the turns, tried to maintain some sense of direction, but the fear and the darkness and the lack of oxygen made everything blur together. When the car finally stopped, she heard doors opening. Cold air rushed in when the trunk opened. Hands grabbed her again, dragged her out onto frozen ground. The bag was ripped off her head. Grace gasped, sucking in freezing air that burned her lungs. She was in an industrial area, warehouses and empty lots and buildings with broken windows. Snow fell steadily, already accumulating on the ground, on the abandoned shipping containers, on everything. Tyler stood in front of her, hands in his pockets, looking almost apologetic. I really am sorry, he said. If it helps, hypothermia is supposed to be peaceful. You just fall asleep. No pain. Grace tried to speak, but her throat was closed with terror. Tyler crouched down in front of her. Did you tell anyone what you heard, anyone at all? Grace shook her head frantically. I want to believe you. Tyler reached out, checked her pulse at her neck. Strong heartbeat, you're young, healthy. Probably got about 2 hours before the cold gets you. Maybe 3 if you're stubborn. He stood, brushed snow off his coat. For what it's worth, this isn't personal, it's just business. Then he walked away, got back in the car, drove away into the snowy darkness. Grace knelt in the snow, hands zip-tied behind her back, and watched the taillights disappear. The cold was immediate and absolute. Grace had lived through Minnesota winters, had walked to work in sub-zero temperatures, had shoveled snow in wind that cut like knives. She thought she understood cold. She'd been wrong. This cold was alive, malicious. It crawled up through her knees where they pressed against frozen ground. It seeped through her uniform, through her thin coat, found every gap and opening and vulnerable place. Within 5 minutes, Grace couldn't feel her hands. Within 10, her feet had gone numb. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. The zip ties had cut off circulation to her hands, and without the ability to catch herself standing was impossible. She fell sideways, face hitting snow ice crystals scraping against her cheek. Get up, move. If you stop moving, you die. Grace rolled onto her back, staring up at the falling snow. Each flake was perfect, crystalline, beautiful. They landed on her face, melted against her skin, and the wetness felt like tears. Lillian. The thought surfaced through the fog of cold. Lillian needs you. Grace tried again to sit up, managed it this time, though the effort left her gasping. Her breath came out in white clouds that dissipated almost instantly. Think. There has to be a way out. The zip ties were industrial-grade thick plastic that didn't give when she pulled against them. Her fingers had no sensation, no strength. Even if she could reach the ties, she couldn't break them. The warehouse district was abandoned. No late-night workers, no passing cars, no one to hear if she screamed. Tyler had chosen this location carefully. Remote, quiet, easy to erase evidence. Grace's phone was in her coat pocket. If she could just reach it, if she could call for help. But her hands were behind her back, zip-tied and useless. The phone might as well have been on the moon. Time became fluid. Grace couldn't tell if minutes or hours had passed. The snow continued falling, piling up around her, on her. She was being buried alive in ice. Her heartbeat slowed. She could feel it, could hear it in her ears, the rhythm of life winding down. Lillian's face flashed behind Grace's eyes. Lillian at 7, gap-toothed and laughing. Lillian at 12, crying at their parents' funeral. Lillian last week, gray-skinned and tired, hooked up to the dialysis machine. Who's going to take care of her now? Grace's phone buzzed in her pocket. The vibration was faint, barely perceptible through the layers of fabric and the numbness of approaching hypothermia. But it was there, a small reminder that the world beyond this frozen lot still existed. With effort that felt superhuman, Grace twisted, managed to roll onto her side. Her coat had ridden up. The phone was visible now, just barely sticking out of her pocket. If she could just reach it. If she could just... Grace contorted her body, ignoring the screaming pain in her shoulders as she tried to bring her bound hands around to her pocket. The zip ties cut deeper, drawing blood that she couldn't feel. Her frozen fingers fumbled uselessly. The phone buzzed again. Grace sobbed a sound that came out as a weak gasp. She stretched further and pain exploded through her shoulders as the joints strained past their natural range. But her fingers, numb, clumsy, barely functional, brushed against the phone's edge. She managed to pull it free. It fell into the snow beside her. The screen was lit. A text message notification glowed in the darkness. From Lillian. "Night shift again, you work too hard. Love you, sis." Grace stared at those words, "Love you, sis." The heart emoji seemed obscene in its normalcy. Its simple expression of affection in a world where Grace was dying alone in a frozen industrial lot. She couldn't reply, couldn't even hold the phone properly, but she could see the message, could hold onto it like a lifeline. "I love you too," Grace whispered through blue lips. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I failed you." The phone's screen dimmed to save battery. Grace closed her eyes. 1:17 a.m. Dominic Ashford didn't believe in coincidence. In his world, patterns meant something. Disruptions meant danger, and tonight the pattern was wrong. A delivery that should have arrived at midnight was missing. The driver wasn't answering his phone. The warehouse manager reported irregularities in inventory rope gone logged but unaccounted for. Small things, easy to dismiss as clerical errors or simple delays. But Dominic hadn't built an empire by dismissing small things. He drove through the warehouse district himself, which his security team had advised against. But Dominic had learned young that you couldn't lead from a distance. You had to see things with your own eyes, smell the air for smoke before the fire became visible. The snow made driving treacherous. His SUV's tires crunched through 4 inches of fresh powder. The windshield wipers worked overtime, clearing flakes that fell faster than they could sweep. Dominic was 3 blocks from the northeast warehouse when he saw it. A dark shape in the snow. Too large to be debris, too still to be an animal. He slowed the SUV, pulled to the curb, left the engine running and the headlights on. The shape was a person, lying on their side in the snow, not moving. Dominic approached cautiously. His hand went automatically to the gun holstered at his hip. This could be a trap, could be bait, could be a dozen different threats disguised as a body in the snow. But as he got closer, details emerged that made his jaw tighten. A woman, young mid-20s, wearing a diner uniform under a cheap winter coat. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back with thick industrial-grade ties. Blood had dried on her temple where she'd been struck. Her lips were blue, her skin gray, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Dominic knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. They're weak, thready, but present. His eyes went to the zip ties. He recognized them immediately. Same brand his warehouses used for securing shipments. Same width, same yellow color, same locking mechanism. Someone had used his supplies in his territory without his permission. Dominic's hand tightened on the woman's wrist, gently checking her pulse, but the anger was sharp beneath the clinical assessment. This wasn't random violence. This was a message, or a mistake. Either way, it was unacceptable. He started to reach for his phone to call his medic when he noticed something glowing in the snow beside the woman's body. A phone, screen lit with a text message. Dominic read it without touching the device. "Night shift again. You work too hard. Love you, sis." A sister. This woman had a sister who loved her, who worried about her working too hard, who sent heart emojis at 1 in the morning. This woman had someone waiting for her to come home. For 3 seconds, 3 long seconds that Dominic would remember later, he stood at a crossroads. The smart move was to call it in. Have his cleanup crew handle it. This wasn't his problem. Getting involved with a dying woman meant questions, complications, exposure he couldn't afford. But the zip ties were his, and someone in his organization had done this without permission, which meant his control was fractured, his rules were being broken, his empire was showing cracks. Dominic removed his cashmere coat, $1,500 custom tailored, now dusted with snow. and wrapped it around the woman's trembling body. "Not tonight," he said quietly. "Not in my city." He lifted her carefully, noting her light weight, the way her head lolled against his shoulder. She was barely conscious, hypothermia deep into stage 2. Another 20 minutes and he'd be carrying a corpse. Dominic placed her in the back seat of the SUV, cranked the heat to maximum, and pulled out his phone. "Dr. Cross." His voice was clipped, controlled. "Safe house. Hypothermia patient. 20 minutes. Have everything ready." He hung up before the doctor could ask questions. In the back seat, the woman stirred a weak moan, escaping blue lips. Dominic met her eyes in the rearview mirror. They were unfocused, glassy with shock, but aware she was trying to speak. "Don't," he said. "Save your strength. You're going to need it." Because whoever had left her to die was about to learn a very expensive lesson about operating in Dominic Ashford's territory without permission. Grace woke to concrete walls and the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was still in the snow. The cold lingered in her bones, a deep chill that no amount of blankets seemed to touch. But the surface beneath her was soft, a mattress thin, but present. And the air, while cool, didn't burn her lungs with each breath. She tried to sit up. Pain exploded through her shoulders, a reminder of how she'd contorted her body trying to reach her phone. Her wrists throbbed where the zip ties had cut circulation. When she looked down, she saw bandages wrapped around both forearms. White gauze stark against her pale skin. "Easy!" The voice came from the shadows. "Dr. Cross said you'd be disoriented when you woke up." Grace's head snapped toward the sound. A woman stood near the door, tall, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She wore tactical clothing, all black, with the kind of posture that spoke of military training. Her hand rested casually on her hip, inches from a holstered weapon. "Where am I?" Grace's voice came out as a rasp, her throat raw from screaming that she couldn't remember. "Safe house." The woman's expression didn't change. "You've been unconscious for 18 hours. Severe hypothermia, mild frostbite on your fingers and toes. Dr. Cross says you're lucky to be alive." "Lucky?" Grace almost laughed. "And you are Helena Pierce. I'm here to make sure you stay alive." Helena moved closer, and Grace noticed she walked with the fluid efficiency of someone trained to respond to threats. "There's water on the table. Drink it. You're still dehydrated." Grace looked around the room properly now. Concrete walls, no windows, a single door with a heavy lock. A metal frame bed, a wooden chair. A radiator in the corner that clanked and hissed, pushing tepid heat into the cold space. This wasn't a safe house, this was a cell. "I want to leave," Grace said. "No, you don't." Helena's tone was matter-of-fact. "Because the man who left you in the snow thinks you're dead. And if you walk out that door, he'll make sure his assumption becomes fact." The memory crashed back. Tyler Brennan's apologetic smile. The zip ties cutting into her wrists, the endless cold. Grace's breath caught in her throat. "My sister," she gasped. "Lillian, I need to call her. She'll be worried. Already handled." Helena pulled out a phone, Grace's phone, she realized. "We've been texting her from your number. Work training trip in Philadelphia. 2 weeks. She believes you're safe." The casual invasion of her privacy should have angered Grace. Instead, she felt only relief. Lillian didn't know, didn't need to be terrified. "Who's we?" Grace asked quietly. The door opened before Helena could answer. Dominic Ashford entered like he owned the space, which Grace realized he probably did. In the fluorescent light, she could see him clearly for the first time. Tall, over 6 feet, with the kind of lean build that came from discipline rather than vanity. His black hair was shot through with gray at the temples. His face was all sharp angles and harder edges, with dark eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing. He wore a black suit, perfectly tailored, with the top button of his shirt undone. No tie, expensive watch, rings on 3 fingers that caught the light when he moved, and on his neck, just visible above his collar, the edge of a tattoo, intricate linework that suggested a larger piece hidden beneath his clothes. This was the man who'd pulled her from the snow. Grace remembered his voice in the SUV, calm and controlled, even as she'd been dying. "Save your strength. You're going to need it." Dominic pulled the wooden chair closer to the bed and sat resting his forearms on his knees. He studied Grace with the same intensity she imagined he'd use to assess a business deal or a threat. Grace Winters, he said. It wasn't a question. 24 years old, employed at Rosewood Diner for 2 years night shift, lives with her sister Lillian in a studio apartment on 4th Street. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants. By all accounts, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. The casual recitation of her personal information should have terrified her. Instead, Grace felt oddly detached, like she was listening to someone describe a stranger. "Then why am I here?" she asked. Dominic reached into his jacket and pulled out a clear plastic bag. Inside were the zip ties that had bound her wrists, now cut open but still stained with her dried blood. "These," he said, "came from my Northeast warehouse. Same brand we use for securing shipments. Same supplier. Same inventory logs." He set the bag on the bed between them. "Someone in my organization used my resources to try to kill you. Without my permission. In my territory." Grace looked at the zip ties, then back at Dominic. "And that matters to you, permission. Permission is the only thing that matters." Dominic's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "I built this empire on rules, on structure, on the understanding that nothing happens without authorization. When someone breaks those rules, they're not just betraying me, they're declaring that control is negotiable. And control is never negotiable. So you saved me to prove a point. I saved you because whoever left you to die made a critical error in judgment." Dominic leaned back slightly. "They assumed you were expendable, that your death would go unnoticed. That's sloppy, and sloppiness in my organization means the structure is fracturing." Grace processed this. She'd been saved not out of compassion, but because her attempted murder was evidence of a larger problem. The thought should have been chilling. Instead, it was clarifying. "What do you want from me?" Grace asked. "Information." Dominic's eyes never left her face. "The men who tried to kill you didn't do it randomly. You heard something, saw something, know something that made you dangerous. Tell me what it is." Grace's hand went instinctively to her coat pocket, except she wasn't wearing her coat anymore. She was in clean clothes, soft cotton pants, and a sweater that were too big for her frame. Her coat, her uniform, her phone all taken while she'd been unconscious. Dominic noticed the gesture. "Looking for this?" He held up her phone. The screen was dark, but Grace knew what was on it. 14 days of recordings, hours of conversations about shipments and territories and operations she didn't understand. Her insurance policy. "I work at a diner," Grace said carefully. "I refill coffee, I clear plates. Sometimes I overhear conversations." "What kind of conversations?" Grace met his eyes. In them she saw the same cold calculation Tyler Brennan had shown. But underneath it there was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or respect for someone who understood when to hold their cards close. "The kind," Grace said slowly, "that involve your name, your territory, your operations." Dominic's expression didn't change. "Did you record them?" There it was. The question that would determine whether she walked out of this room or disappeared into the same snow that had nearly claimed her. Grace made a decision. "Yes," she said. 14 days of audio, names, locations, shipment details. I recorded everything." Helena's hand moved fractionally closer to her weapon. Dominic remained perfectly still. "Why?" he asked. "My sister is dying." The words came out flat, empty of the emotion that usually accompanied them. "Kidney failure. She needs a transplant that costs $180,000. She has 90 days, maybe less. I heard information that might be valuable. I thought..." Grace's voice cracked. "I thought maybe I could use it, trade it. I don't know. I was desperate." "Desperate people make dangerous choices," Dominic observed. "Desperate people make the only choices they can." Silence stretched between them. Helena stood motionless by the door. The radiator clanked and hissed, marking time in metallic rhythm. Finally, Dominic spoke. "Show me." Grace's hand trembled as Dominic handed her the phone. She unlocked it. He'd known her passcode had clearly already accessed everything and opened the recording app. 14 files, each one labeled with a date and time. She selected the most recent one, pressed play. Tyler Brennan's voice filled the small room, tinny through the phone's speaker, but unmistakable. Ashford's been distracted. His lieutenant handles the details now. Volkov won't move until we confirm the route is clean. Dominic's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Grace stopped the playback. There's more, she said quietly. Conversations about Pier 9, about someone named Brennan being a weak link, about moving product through your territory without your knowledge. Tyler Brennan. Dominic stood, began pacing the small room like a caged predator. My lieutenant. 8 years of loyalty. Competent, controlled, trusted with operations I don't oversee personally. Trusted, Grace repeated. Past tense. Dominic stopped pacing, looked at her with something that might have been approval. You're observant. That's the skill that almost got you killed. It's the skill that kept me alive. Grace held up the phone. I set up a dead man's switch. If I don't input a code every 24 hours, these recordings auto-send to the FBI, the local news, and 3 lawyers I found on Google. Helena made a sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. Dominic's expression remained neutral. Clever. Suicidal, but clever. It's insurance, Grace said. You understand insurance, Mr. Ashford. You built an empire on it. Insurance against betrayal, against sloppiness, against people who think rules don't apply to them. And what do you want in exchange for that insurance? Grace had thought about this during the endless cold, during those moments when she'd been certain she was dying. The answer was simple and impossible. I want my sister to live, she said. I want to go home. I want to be unnoticed again. Unnoticed. Dominic considered the word. Tyler Brennan already saw you, Grace. You can't become a ghost to someone who's decided you're a threat. Then what do you suggest? I suggest, Dominic said slowly, that you stay here under protection while I determine who in my organization tried to kill you and why. And then we discuss what happens to your recordings. And my sister. I'll have my doctors evaluate her case. If a transplant is viable, I'll cover the cost. Grace's breath caught. Why would you do that? Because your survival is valuable to me right now, and ensuring your sister's survival ensures your cooperation. Dominic moved toward the door. Dr. Cross will check on you in a few hours. Helena stays with you. Don't try to leave. And if I do, Dominic paused at the threshold, then Tyler Brennan won't be the only one who thinks you need to disappear. The door closed with a heavy click. The lock engaged. Grace sat alone, not alone. Helena was still there, silent sentinel by the wall, and stared at her phone. Insurance. She'd created insurance to protect herself. Now she just had to hope it was enough. Grace had learned the rhythm of the safe house. Dr. Cross visited twice daily, checking her healing frostbite, monitoring her recovery. Helena brought meals, simple food, nutritious but bland, and stood guard with the kind of patience that came from years of military discipline. And every 12 hours, Dominic appeared to ask questions. He never interrogated, never threatened, just sat in the wooden chair and asked Grace to describe the conversations she'd overheard. The patterns she'd noticed, the details that had seemed important enough to record. Grace told him everything. At this point, cooperation was survival. On the 3rd day, something changed. Grace was attempting to read a book. Helena had brought a thriller that felt obscene in its fictional violence compared to the real danger Grace had experienced when the door opened without the usual warning knock. Dominic entered, but he wasn't alone. A little girl followed him. 5 years old, maybe 6, with dark hair and neat braids and eyes that were identical to Dominic's. She wore a pink dress with small white flowers and held a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The girl said nothing, just stared at Grace with solemn intensity. This is Sophie, Dominic said. My daughter. Sophie, this is Grace. She's staying with us for a while. Sophie continued staring. Grace had enough experience with children. Lillian had been young when their parents died to recognize selective mutism. The child was aware, intelligent, but something had stolen her words. Grace set aside her book and offered a small smile. "Hi, Sophie. That's a very nice rabbit. What's its name?" Sophie clutched the rabbit tighter, didn't speak. "She hasn't talked since her mother died," Dominic said quietly. 3 years. Therapists say it's trauma, that she'll speak when she's ready. Grace's heart constricted. She knew what it was to lose a mother young, knew the silence that came from grief too big for words. "May I?" Grace gestured to the chair beside her bed. Sophie looked up at Dominic. He nodded. The girl crossed the room with careful steps and climbed into the chair Rabbit held against her chest like armor. For several minutes they sat in silence. Grace didn't push, didn't ask questions. Just sat with Sophie in the quiet, offering presence without expectation. Finally, Grace spoke. "I lost my mother too. When I was 12, my little sister was 7. She cried every night for months, but I couldn't cry. It felt like if I started, I'd never stop." Sophie's grip on the rabbit loosened fractionally. "So instead, I read to her," Grace continued, "every night. Stories about brave girls and adventures and happy endings. It helped her, and eventually it helped me too." She gestured to the book on her bed. "Would you like me to read to you?" Sophie looked at the book, looked at Grace, then slowly she nodded. Grace read for 20 minutes, a chapter about a detective solving mysteries in a small town, full of quirky characters and gentle humor. Sophie listened without moving, but her posture relaxed. The rabbit slipped down to rest in her lap instead of clutched against her chest. When Grace finished the chapter, Sophie slid off the chair. She walked to the door where Dominic had been watching silently, but before she left, she turned back. "Safe," Sophie whispered. The word was barely audible, shaped more by breath than voice. But it was there. She said it again, louder this time. "Safe." Then she took Dominic's hand and left the room. Helena, who'd witnessed the entire exchange, spoke for the first time in days. That's the first word she's spoken in 6 months. Grace stared at the closed door, her heart pounding. She'd connected with a child she'd met 5 minutes ago, had coaxed out a single word through patience and shared grief. "Safe," Grace repeated softly. She feels safe. In this concrete room with barred windows and locked doors, a traumatized child had found something she hadn't felt in years. Grace wondered what that said about the world Dominic Ashford had built, and what it said about her that she was beginning to understand it. Grace was asleep when the phone rang. Not her phone that was on the table beside her bed, powered off as per Dominic's instructions. This was Helena's phone, vibrating urgently in the darkness. Grace woke immediately, years of light sleeping honed by night shifts and sick sister emergencies. She sat up as Helena answered the call. "Pierce!" Helena's voice was clipped professional. Then her expression changed. "When? How long ago?" Grace's stomach dropped. Something was wrong. Helena hung up, already moving toward the door. "Stay here. Don't leave this room." "What happened?" "Unrelated incident. I'll be back in 20 minutes. The door closed, locked from outside. Grace sat in the darkness, her heart racing with formless dread. Unrelated incident. But Helena's face had shown genuine alarm, and Grace had learned to read the subtle tells of people trained not to show emotion. Her phone was right there, powered off but present. Grace reached for it, hands shaking, powered it on, waited for the screen to light. 12 missed calls, all from Lillian's number, and 1 text message sent 40 minutes ago. "Grace, where are you?" "They took me from the hospital. They said if you don't give them something, they'll hurt me. Please, Grace, I'm scared." The phone slipped from Grace's numb fingers. "No, no, 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 no." She grabbed it back, called Lillian's number. It rang once, twice. A woman answered. Not Lillian. "Grace Winters." The voice was cold, efficient. "I was wondering when you'd check your messages." "Who is this? Where's my sister?" "Your sister is safe. For now. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on your cooperation." Grace's vision blurred with tears. "Please. She's sick. She needs her dialysis. We're aware of her medical needs, which is why you have 24 hours to deliver the recordings you made. All of them, including backups. In exchange, your sister goes free. How do I know she's alive? Let me talk to her. A pause. Then Lillian's voice, terrified and small. Grace, I don't understand what's happening. These people, they said you have something they want. Lillian, baby, I'm going to fix this, I promise. The other woman's voice returned. Pier 7, midnight tomorrow, bring the recordings, come alone. If we see police, if we see Ashford's people, if you deviate from these instructions in any way, your sister dies. Do you understand? Yes, Grace whispered. I understand. Smart girl. Midnight tomorrow. Don't be late. The line went dead. Grace sat in the darkness, clutching the phone, and felt her carefully constructed insurance policy crumble to dust. The recordings were supposed to protect her. Instead, they'd painted a target on the only person she loved. The door opened. Dominic entered instead of Helena, and one look at Grace's face told him everything. What happened? Grace looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. They took Lillian. Dominic listened without interrupting as Grace explained the call, the demands, the 24-hour deadline. When she finished, he pulled out his own phone and made a call. Jackson, conference room, 5 minutes, bring everything we have on Tyler Brennan's outside contacts. He hung up, looked at Grace. Get dressed, you're coming with me. I thought I was supposed to stay. That was before they escalated. Dominic moved to the door. Your sister's kidnapping isn't random, it's coordinated, which means Tyler isn't working alone. 5 minutes later, Grace found herself in a different part of the building, a legitimate-looking office space with computers and filing cabinets and a conference table that could seat 12. Jackson Reed was already there, spreading documents across the table's surface. Jackson was younger than Dominic, maybe 38, with the build of a former athlete and eyes that tracked everything. He acknowledged Grace with a brief nod before addressing Dominic. Tyler's been sloppy, Jackson said, tapping a series of financial records. Deposits that don't match his salary, cash withdrawals in patterns consistent with payoffs. And this, he pulled up a photo on a tablet. Surveillance from 3 weeks ago. Tyler meeting with known associates of Konstantin Volkov. Volkov, Dominic's voice went flat. He's behind this. Volkov wants your North Harbor territory, has for years. Tyler's giving him intelligence in exchange for money and promises of his own operation once you're out of the picture. Grace struggled to follow the conversation. Who's Volkov? Russian mob, Jackson explained. Operates gambling and extortion, ambitious, wants to expand into shipping, which means he needs access to the ports Dominic controls. And my sister, Dominic met her eyes. Leverage. They know the recordings could expose Volkov's entire network. They also know you won't sacrifice Lillian to protect evidence. So what do? You don't do anything. Dominic's tone brooked no argument. I handle this. She's my sister, and walking into that exchange alone gets you both killed. Dominic began pacing the same caged predator movement Grace had seen before. They want the recordings. We give them copies, useless copies with altered audio while keeping the originals. We position teams around Pier 7. When they bring Lillian for the exchange, we take them. And if something goes wrong, Grace's voice cracked. If they realize the recordings are fake, if they panic and hurt her, Jackson answered before Dominic could. Then we adapt, but going in without a plan guarantees failure. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to scream that these were cold calculations when her sister's life hung in the balance, but she'd learned in 3 days that Dominic Ashford's world ran on strategy, not emotion. I'm going, she said firmly, to the exchange. Lillian won't trust strangers. She'll be terrified. She needs to see me. Absolutely not. It's not a request. Grace stood faced Dominic across the conference table. You said it yourself, they want me there. If I don't show, they'll know something's wrong. I'm the only leverage that guarantees they bring Lillian alive. Dominic studied her with those dark, assessing eyes. You're willing to risk your life for your sister. Every single time. Something shifted in Dominic's expression. Not softening, he was too controlled for that, but acknowledgement. Understanding, perhaps, from a father who would do the same for his daughter. "Fine," he said. "But you follow my instructions exactly. You wear a wire, you stay in communication, and if I say, abort, you run." Grace nodded. "What about the recordings, the real ones?" "Already handled." Dominic pulled out a business card in an attorney's office downtown. "My lawyer has copies in a safe deposit box. If anything happens to you or your sister, they auto-release to federal authorities. Your dead man's switch stays active." "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." Dominic's expression was grim. Volkov doesn't negotiate in good faith. He wants you dead, wants me weakened, wants the territory that comes with eliminating competition. This exchange is a trap. We're just making sure we spring it on our terms instead of his. Midnight arrived with freezing rain instead of snow. Grace stood at the edge of Pier 7, the cold water of the harbor lapping against wooden pylons 20 feet below. She wore a wire taped between her shoulder blades, hidden beneath layers of clothing. In her pocket, a USB drive containing the doctored recordings files that would play for 30 seconds before degrading into static. Dominic stood beside her, scanning the darkness. Jackson and 6 other men were positioned throughout the pier area on rooftops behind shipping containers in parked vehicles with darkened windows. 8 men total. Grace tried not to think about how 8 men might not be enough. "Remember," Dominic said quietly, "when you see Lillian, you stay calm, you don't run to her, you wait for my signal. And if things go wrong, then you drop and you stay down, let us handle it." Grace's hands trembled, not from cold this time, but from fear. "Dominic, we'll get her back, Grace, I promise you that." Before Grace could respond, headlights appeared at the far end of the pier. A black SUV approached slowly, tires splashing through puddles. It stopped 50 feet away. The passenger door opened. A woman emerged, late 30s, elegant even in tactical clothing with red hair pulled back in a braid. She held a phone in one hand. "Grace Winters," the woman called across the distance. "I'm Natalie Brennan, Tyler's wife. You can probably guess why I'm here." Brennan. Tyler's wife was the one making demands. Grace's stomach churned. "Where's my sister?" Grace shouted back. "Safe, for now." Natalie gestured to the SUV. "Show me the recordings first." Grace held up the USB drive. "Lillian first." "Not how this works, sweetheart." Dominic's voice was low in Grace's ear, transmitted through the wire. "Stall! We need them to bring Lillian out." Grace took 3 steps forward. "I want proof she's alive. Video call, now, or I walk away and these recordings go straight to the FBI." Natalie considered this, then pulled out her phone. 30 seconds later, she turned the screen toward Grace. Lillian's face appeared tear-stained and terrified, bound to a chair in what looked like a warehouse. She was alive, conscious, scared but unharmed. Relief hit Grace so hard her knees nearly buckled. "Satisfied?" Natalie asked. "Bring her here, to the exchange point, then you get the recordings." "I don't think so." Natalie pocketed her phone. "You're in no position to negotiate, Grace. Your sister's life for the drive, that's the deal." "Then come take it." Grace held the USB drive up, clearly visible. Waited. Natalie made a decision. She gestured to someone in the SUV. The back door opened. A man emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive coat despite the freezing rain. Even from 50 feet away, Grace could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Konstantin Volkov had come personally. "This just got complicated." Jackson's voice crackled through the wire to Dominic. "That's Volkov himself. He wouldn't show unless—" The rest of Jackson's warning was cut off by the sound of engines. Multiple vehicles appeared from different directions, blocking the pier entrance surrounding the area. Men emerged from cars and vans, armed and moving with military precision. 8 men. Volkov had brought 8 men to the original count. Now there were at least 12. Grace's heart hammered. This was the trap Dominic had warned about. Volkov stepped forward, hands in his pockets, utterly calm. "Grace Winters, the waitress who heard too much. You've caused me considerable trouble." "Where's my sister?" Nearby. You'll see her soon, but first, Volkov gestured to Natalie. The recordings, all of them including backups. I know about your dead man's switch. I know about the lawyer. You're going to call them right now and have those files deleted. And if I refuse, Volkov smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Then your sister loses a kidney right here, right now. I have a doctor standing by. She'll survive the procedure, probably, but she'll never get a transplant after. Damaged goods. Beside Grace, Dominic went perfectly still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. That wasn't the deal, Grace said, voice shaking. The deal changed. Volkov pulled out a gun, casual, almost lazy in the movement. He didn't point it at Grace. He pointed it at Dominic. I don't want the recordings to protect my operation, Mrs. Winters. I want them to destroy Ashford. Evidence of his criminal enterprise delivered anonymously to federal authorities. His reputation in ruins, his organization fractured, his territory up for grabs. The trap wasn't just for Grace, it was for Dominic. You wanted me here, Dominic said calmly. You used the girl as bait to draw me out. I wanted you exposed. Volkov's finger moved to the trigger. Dead or alive doesn't matter. But your empire ends tonight. Everything happened at once. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops, Jackson and his team engaging Volkov's men. Dominic grabbed Grace and pulled her behind a shipping container as bullets pinged off metal. The SUV that had brought Natalie exploded into motion tires, screaming as it tried to escape. Grace hit the ground hard, Dominic covering her body with his own. The wire in her back dug painfully against concrete. Stay down, Dominic shouted over the chaos. But Grace couldn't stay down. Couldn't hide while Lillian was somewhere in this nightmare. She pushed against Dominic, trying to see through the smoke and confusion. A figure ran past their cover, one of Volkov's men fleeing the firefight. Grace recognized the tactical vest, the weapon, the way he moved, and she saw where he was running. Toward a white van parked at the edge of the pier. A van that hadn't been there before. Lillian was in that van. Grace knew it the way you know truth in your bones. She broke from Dominic's protective hold and ran. Grace, no. But Grace was already moving, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. She reached the van as the man tried to climb into the driver's seat. Without thinking, without planning, Grace grabbed a piece of broken rebar from the ground and swung. The metal connected with the man's knee. He went down with a scream weapon clattering away. Grace wrenched open the van's back doors. Lillian was there, bound to a bench seat, tape over her mouth, eyes wide with terror and recognition. I've got you, Grace gasped, climbing into the van. I've got you, baby. You're safe. Her hands shook as she pulled the tape away from Lillian's mouth, started working on the ropes binding her sister's wrists. Behind her, the firefight continued. Volkov was shouting orders. Jackson's team was returning fire with precision. And somewhere in the chaos, Dominic was searching for Grace, his voice cutting through the night. Grace, where are you? The ropes came free. Lillian collapsed into Grace's arms, sobbing. I thought you were dead, Lillian choked out. The woman said you'd left me, that you'd traded me for money. Never. Grace held her sister tight. I will never leave you, never. A shadow fell across the open van doors. Grace looked up, expecting Dominic. Tyler Brennan stood there instead, gun in hand, face twisted with rage. You just don't know when to die, do you? He snarled. Grace positioned herself between Tyler and Lillian. She had no weapon, no plan, no way to fight a man twice her size with a loaded gun. Tyler raised the weapon, finger moving to the trigger. Grace saw it happen in slow motion, saw the barrel pointing at her chest, saw Tyler's finger tightening, saw her death approaching with mechanical certainty. On the ground beside her, fallen from Volkov's man when she'd struck him, lay a weapon. Small caliber handgun, safety already off. Grace didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't consider consequences or morality or the weight of taking a life. She grabbed the gun, raised it with shaking hands, and fired. The recoil knocked her backward. The shot went wide, hit Tyler's shoulder instead of center mass, but it was enough. Tyler's weapon clattered to the ground. He spun, face twisting with shock and pain, staring at Grace like he couldn't comprehend that she, the waitress, the nobody, the woman he'd left to freeze, had just shot him. Not tonight. Grace said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Not ever again. Tyler staggered, collapsed against the van. Blood spread across his expensive shirt. Behind him, Natalie Brennan emerged from the shadows, hands raised in surrender. I'm done, she said quietly, staring at her husband bleeding on the ground. Done enabling him. Done being part of this. She looked at Grace. My kids need a mother, not a criminal. Sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights approached from multiple directions. Dominic appeared at the van, breathing hard. Jacket torn from the fight, he took in the scene, Grace holding the weapon, Tyler bleeding, Lillian safe, Natalie surrendering. FBI! Someone shouted from the pier entrance. Everyone on the ground, hands where we can see them. Dominic met Grace's eyes. This was always the plan, he said quietly. I called them before we came. Evidence was already in their hands. This just confirmed everything. Grace stared at him, still holding the gun. You set this up, used us as bait. I used Volkov's greed against him. Dominic's expression was unreadable. Your sister's safe. The criminals are in custody. Justice Grace, the legal kind. Federal agents swarmed the pier. Grace watched as they arrested Tyler, still alive, clutching his shoulder wound, screaming threats through the pain. Watched as they took Volkov into custody, reading him his rights while he snarled in Russian. Watched as Natalie walked calmly toward the agents, hands up, ready to testify in exchange for leniency. Dominic stepped back from the van, hands visible, no resistance when two agents approached him. They didn't handcuff him, didn't even search him, just spoke briefly, nodded, and let him go. Immunity deal, Grace realized. He'd already negotiated immunity. An EMT reached the van, started checking Lillian for injuries. Grace let them work, numb with shock and exhaustion. It was over. Somehow, impossibly, it was over. Lillian was alive, Tyler was bleeding but in custody. Volkov was arrested, and Grace had pulled the trigger. Had shot a man, had crossed a line she'd never imagined crossing. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. The gun had already been taken by an evidence tech, bagged and tagged. But Grace could still feel the weight of it, could still hear the sound of the shot, could still see Tyler's face when he realized she'd fought back. The waitress who'd been left to freeze had survived, and she'd made sure Tyler Brennan understood she was done being a victim. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and institutional coffee. Grace sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the waiting room, watching nurses move through hallways with practiced efficiency. Somewhere above her on the 4th floor, Lillian was undergoing dialysis while doctors ran tests to determine her eligibility for transplant. It had been 48 hours since Pier 7. 48 hours since the FBI had swarmed the scene, since Tyler Brennan had been loaded into an ambulance with a gunshot wound to the shoulder. Since Konstantin Volkov had been taken into federal custody in handcuffs that seemed almost theatrical in their gleaming silver. 48 hours, and Grace still felt like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Ms. Winters. A doctor approached, clipboard in hand. He was older, maybe 60, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I'm Dr. Morrison. I've been overseeing your sister's case. Grace stood on legs that felt unsteady. Is she okay? The tests show that she's a viable candidate for transplant. Dr. Morrison's smile was genuine. Her kidney function has deteriorated, but not beyond the point where transplant would be effective. The challenge, as I'm sure you're aware, is finding a compatible donor and managing the cost. The cost is handled, Grace said quietly. She didn't elaborate. Didn't mention Dominic Ashford or the deal they'd made or the way her life had become tangled with organized crime and federal investigations. Dr. Morrison raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Then I have good news. We have a donor. Anonymous through the registry. Compatible tissue match. The surgery can be scheduled within the week. Grace's knees buckled. She sat down hard in the plastic chair, her vision blurring with tears she'd been holding back for days. A week, she whispered. Barring complications, yes. Dr. Morrison's hand was steady on her shoulder. Your sister is going to live, Ms. Winters. She's going to have a chance at a normal life. Normal. Grace had forgotten what that word meant. The federal courtroom was smaller than Grace had imagined. She'd seen courtrooms on television, grand spaces with high ceilings and dramatic lighting. This was functional, almost mundane, with industrial carpet and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. Grace sat in the gallery, hands folded in her lap. Beside her, an FBI agent named Sarah Reeves kept a professional distance while ensuring Grace didn't flee. Not that Grace had anywhere to run. Her entire life for the past 2 weeks had existed in the space between hospital rooms and federal buildings. At the defendant's table, Tyler Brennan sat in an orange jumpsuit, his shoulder heavily bandaged from the gunshot wound Grace had given him. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished. The expensive suits and confident swagger had been stripped away, leaving only a man facing the consequences of his choices. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variety of human weakness, read from the charges. Tyler James Brennan, you have been charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit racketeering, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead? Tyler's lawyer, a public defender who looked exhausted, stood. Guilty, Your Honor. On all counts. No trial. No drawn-out legal battle. Tyler had taken a plea deal, full confession and testimony against Volkov in exchange for a finite sentence instead of life without parole. The judge's eyes were hard. Mr. Brennan, you have admitted to leaving Grace Winters bound and helpless in sub-zero temperatures, fully aware that she would die of exposure. You kidnapped her 19-year-old sister from a hospital bed. You conspired with a known criminal organization to undermine legitimate business operations. She paused, letting the weight of each crime settle. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? Tyler stood slowly. For a moment, Grace thought he might apologize, might show some flicker of remorse. Instead, he said, I did what I had to do for my family, for my future. The judge's expression didn't change. Your choices have consequences, Mr. Brennan. 25 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. Restitution to be paid to the victims in amounts determined by separate civil proceedings. 25 years. Grace did the math automatically. Tyler was 35 now. He'd be 60 when he was released. His children, because Grace had learned he had 2 young sons, would be adults. His life as he'd known it was over. She should have felt satisfaction. Justice had been served, visible and concrete. Instead, she felt only hollow exhaustion. As Tyler was led away, he looked back once. His eyes found Grace in the gallery. There was no apology there, no regret, just cold assessment, as if he was still calculating odds, still looking for an angle. Then he was gone. Natalie Brennan's sentencing came 3 days later. Unlike Tyler, Natalie had cooperated fully from the moment she'd surrendered at Pier 7. She'd given the FBI detailed records of Tyler's dealings with Volkov, financial documents showing money laundering through charity organizations, and testimony that filled in gaps the federal investigation had been missing for months. Grace didn't attend that hearing. She read about it later in the newspaper, a brief article buried on page 6. Natalie had received 10 years with possibility of parole after 5. Her children were in foster care awaiting placement with relatives. The article included a quote from Natalie's statement to the court. I enabled my husband's crimes out of greed and fear. I chose money over morality. But when I saw what we'd become, people who would harm an innocent girl to protect our lifestyle, I couldn't be that person anymore. I want my sons to know their mother made the right choice, even if it came too late. Grace folded the newspaper and set it aside. In the bed beside her, Lillian slept fitfully, recovering from transplant surgery that had taken 7 hours and left her exhausted but alive. The new kidney was functioning. The anti-rejection medications were working. Dr. Morrison was cautiously optimistic. Lillian would live. That was the only justice that mattered. Dominic Ashford appeared at the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying flowers that looked expensive and slightly out of place in the institutional setting. Grace was in Lillian's room, helping her sister walk slow laps around the floor, building strength fighting atrophy. reclaiming the body that illness had stolen. "I'll be back in 10 minutes," Grace told Lillian, who was being supervised by a physical therapist. She met Dominic in the family waiting area at the end of the hall. He'd set the flowers on a table, was staring out the window at the city below. He wore a suit, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, but the edge of exhaustion around his eyes suggested the weight he was carrying. "You didn't have to come," Grace said quietly. "I wanted to see how your sister was recovering." Dominic turned from the window. "The surgery was successful." "Yes. Dr. Morrison says she'll need 6 months of monitoring, but the prognosis is good." "I'm glad." Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted with everything that had happened. Grace had been avoiding this conversation, this moment when she'd have to confront the debt she owed and the price it might carry. "I saw the news," Grace said finally. "About you testifying before the grand jury." Dominic's expression remained neutral. Federal immunity in exchange for information about shipping route corruption. It was strategic. "You're going legitimate. I'm adapting to changing circumstances." He sat in one of the waiting room chairs, gestured for Grace to do the same. "Volkov's arrest created a power vacuum. Other organizations are circling, looking to claim territory. Fighting them would mean war. War means casualties, instability, exposure I can't afford. So you're walking away. I'm choosing a different path." Dominic's hands rested on his knees, and Grace noticed he'd removed the rings he usually wore. "Sophie needs a father who doesn't operate in shadows, who doesn't make decisions that could leave her orphaned. The FBI's deal gives me that chance." Grace studied him, this man who'd saved her life, who'd orchestrated the takedown of his own lieutenant, who'd somehow managed to extract himself from decades of criminal enterprise with nothing more than testimony and strategic cooperation. "What happens now?" she asked. "To you, I mean." "I transition my shipping business to legitimate operations. Consultancy work for port security. The kind of thing that looks good on background checks." His smile was thin. "Respectability through reinvention. It's very American." "And Sophie starts kindergarten in the fall. Regular school, regular life. Maybe she'll even start talking more." The hardness in Dominic's expression softened fractionally. "She asked about you yesterday. Wanted to know if the safe lady was coming back." Grace's throat tightened. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because," Grace gestured helplessly, "because our lives were never supposed to intersect. I'm a waitress who overheard the wrong conversation. You were..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "A criminal," Dominic said calmly. "That's the word you're looking for. I was a criminal who built an empire on intimidation and control, who made decisions that hurt people even if I told myself it was necessary, even if I maintained rules and structure. I didn't mean..." "It's the truth." Dominic stood, moved back to the window. "I've spent 20 years convincing myself that control equals morality, that as long as I maintained order, the methods didn't matter. You proved that wrong." "How?" "Because you survived chaos I created, because your sister is alive despite being caught in machinery I should have dismantled years ago, because a 5-year-old child felt safer with a stranger she'd just met than she'd felt in her own home." He turned to face Grace. "You showed me what I'd become, and what I could still choose to be." Grace stood cross to where Dominic waited. "I don't want your gratitude. I don't want to be the catalyst for your redemption. I just want..." Her voice broke. "I just want to take my sister home and pretend none of this happened." "You can't." Dominic's voice was gentle but firm. "Tyler Brennan tried to kill you. Volkov's organization kidnapped Lillian. Those things happened. Pretending they didn't doesn't make you safe, it makes you vulnerable." "Then what do you suggest?" Dominic reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Thick manila sealed with wax that seemed almost theatrical. "New identity," he said. "Complete documentation. Birth certificate, social security number, driver's license, employment history. Bank account with $50,000 replenished quarterly for 2 years. Apartment lease in Phoenix prepaid for 12 months. Grace stared at the envelope. Phoenix. Warm, no snow, large enough to disappear into transient enough that newcomers don't raise questions. Dominic set the envelope on the table between them. You become Grace Mitchell. Clean slate. New life. Far enough from here that your past stays buried. And Lillian Morgan, your sister, transferring to Arizona State University on medical scholarship. All arranged, all funded through legitimate channels that can't be traced back to me. Grace picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of a future she hadn't chosen but desperately needed. Why are you doing this? Because you deserve the chance to rebuild without looking over your shoulder. To take care of your sister without wondering if someone from my world will use her as leverage. Dominic moved toward the door, then paused. And because Sophie asked me if I was brave like the safe lady, I want to be able to tell her yes. Dominic. He raised a hand, cutting her off gently. There's a phone number in the envelope. Emergencies only. You call it people come. But using it means accepting that you're still connected to this world, still part of the structure you're trying to escape. Use it wisely. Will I see you again? The question emerged before Grace could stop it. Dominic's expression was unreadable. I hope not, for both our sakes. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor, leaving Grace alone with an envelope that held a future written in someone else's handwriting. Sophie came to say goodbye. Dominic brought her to the hospital under the pretense of visiting a sick relative. They found Grace in the courtyard garden, a small outdoor space with benches and struggling plants that somehow survived despite limited sunlight. Lillian was inside, sleeping after physical therapy. Grace had been sitting alone, staring at the envelope she'd opened and closed a dozen times without fully committing to the reality it represented. Sophie approached, slowly clutching the same worn rabbit she'd held during their first meeting. She was wearing a yellow dress today with a cardigan against the autumn chill. Her dark braids were neat and perfect. Hi, Sophie, Grace said softly. Sophie didn't speak, just climbed onto the bench beside Grace and sat rabbit in her lap, small body warm against Grace's side. They sat in silence for several minutes. Grace had learned that Sophie communicated better through presence than words. The girl's selective mutism was improving. She spoke in whispers now, brief sentences to her father and therapist, but silence was still her default. Finally, Sophie pulled something from her cardigan pocket, a piece of paper folded carefully into a square. She handed it to Grace. Grace unfolded it, a drawing done in crayon with the intense concentration only children brought to art. 2 figures holding hands, one tall, one small, a sun in the corner. Hearts floating in the air like balloons, at the bottom in careful letters that wobbled across the page. Thank you for being safe. Love, Sophie. Grace's vision blurred. She pulled Sophie into a hug, feeling the girl's thin arms wrap around her waist. Feeling the trust and affection that this traumatized child was offering so freely. You're very brave, Grace whispered. And your daddy is lucky to have you. Sophie pulled back, looked up at Grace with serious eyes. Are you going away? Yes. Why? How did you explain to a 5-year-old that staying meant danger? That the world her father inhabited, even as he tried to leave it, carried consequences that could splash onto anyone nearby. I need to take care of my sister, Grace said finally. She's been very sick. She needs to be somewhere warm and sunny where she can get better. Arizona, Sophie said, demonstrating the same observational skills her father possessed. Daddy said you're going to Arizona. That's right. Sophie considered this. Then with the simple logic of childhood, she said, Will you come back to visit? Grace met Dominic's eyes over Sophie's head. He stood a respectful distance away, giving them space, but his expression was carefully neutral. No pressure, no expectation, just acknowledgement that whatever Grace answered would become truth. Maybe someday, Grace said gently, when enough time has passed. Sophie nodded, accepting this the way children accepted mysteries they couldn't quite understand. She hugged Grace one more time, fierce and quick, then slid off the bench. Bye, safe lady, Sophie whispered. Goodbye, brave girl. Dominic approached as Sophie returned to his side. He extended his hand, formal, respectful, the gesture of equals rather than savior and saved. Grace shook it. His grip was firm, warm, brief. "Take care of yourself, Grace Winters," he said. "You too, Dominic Ashford." They stood there for a moment, two people whose lives had intersected in violence and snow and impossible choices. Two people who'd saved each other in ways neither had expected. Then Dominic took Sophie's hand and walked away. Grace watched them go, the reformed criminal and his healing daughter walking toward whatever future they'd build from the ruins of the past. She hoped they made it, hoped Sophie grew up safe and loved, hoped Dominic found whatever redemption looked like for men who'd built empires in shadows and then chosen sunlight. But she wouldn't be there to see it. Grace looked down at the envelope. Grace Mitchell, Phoenix, Arizona. A new identity for a new life. She opened it one more time and started memorizing the details. The heat was disorienting after a lifetime of northeastern winters. Grace Mitchell now, though she still thought of herself as Winters in quiet moments, stood outside a modest office building in downtown Phoenix, staring at the brass plaque beside the door. Winters Hope Foundation, Victim Advocacy and Witness Relocation Services. It had taken 6 months to build. 6 months of paperwork and nonprofit applications and finding office space that was affordable but respectable. 6 months of late nights writing grant proposals and reaching out to lawyers and social workers and former FBI agents who specialized in witness protection. 6 months of turning her own trauma into purpose. The foundation was small, just Grace and 2 volunteers plus a rotating roster of lawyers who donated hours. But it was real, tangible. A place where people caught in the machinery of criminal enterprise could find resources, legal aid, relocation assistance. A place where witnesses didn't have to disappear alone. Grace unlocked the door and stepped into the small reception area. Lillian was already there, organizing files, looking healthier than Grace had seen her in years. The transplant had held. The medications were working. Lillian had gained weight, color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes sparkled with the energy of someone who'd been given a second chance at life. "Morning," Lillian said, looking up from the filing cabinet. "We have 3 new intake appointments today, 2 domestic violence witnesses, 1 white-collar crime informant." "Coffee first," Grace said, moving toward the small kitchenette they'd set up in the back office. "Then I'll review their cases." "Already made." Lillian poured a cup, handed it to Grace. "And before you ask, yes, I took my morning meds. Yes, I'm drinking enough water. Yes, I have my appointment with Dr. Chen at 2. Grace smiled. "You're getting good at anticipating my questions. I've had 24 years of practice." They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Grace reviewed intake forms, made notes about housing options and legal representation. Lillian answered phone calls and scheduled appointments with the calm efficiency of someone who'd found her calling. Around noon, Grace's phone buzzed with a news alert. "Former shipping magnate testifies in federal corruption trial." Grace clicked the article, knowing she shouldn't, unable to stop herself. The photo showed Dominic Ashford leaving a courthouse flanked by lawyers. He wore a dark suit, his expression unreadable. The article detailed his testimony about port corruption, his cooperation with federal investigators, his transition to legitimate security consulting. No mention of his criminal past, no dramatic exposé, just a man who'd navigated legal gray areas and come out clean on the other side. The final paragraph mentioned that Ashford had recently enrolled his daughter in a prestigious private school, that he'd donated substantially to children's trauma research, that he was rebuilding his life. With the same strategic precision he'd once applied to less legal pursuits. Grace closed the article. Dominic had made it. He and Sophie were safe, legitimate, building something new from the ashes of what they'd left behind. Good. "Was that about him?" Lillian asked quietly. Grace looked up, surprised. They didn't talk about Dominic, didn't discuss the weeks Grace had spent in his world or the debt they owed to a man who'd saved them for reasons that had nothing to do with kindness. "Yeah," Grace admitted. "He's doing okay. Seems like it." Lillian set down the file she'd been organizing. "I never thanked him, for the transplant, for the scholarship, for all of it." He didn't do it for thanks. I know, but still. Lillian met Grace's eyes. Do you ever think about calling using that emergency number he gave you? Grace thought about the business card tucked in her wallet. A single phone number, no name, no context. Insurance she'd never used and hoped she'd never need. No, Grace said. That part of our lives is over. Is it? Lillian's voice was gentle. Because you built an entire nonprofit around helping people in exactly the situation we were in. You wake up at 3 a.m. sometimes and I hear you checking the locks. You flinch when black SUVs drive past. That's trauma. It'll fade. Maybe, Lillian returned to her filing. Or maybe we carry it forever, but we choose what we build from it. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. Grace was in her Phoenix office when Jackson Reed called. She'd programmed his number into her phone 2 years ago, the emergency contact Dominic had provided. It had never rung, until now. Ms. Mitchell? Jackson's voice was clipped professional. I'm calling with a security update. Konstantin Volkov was released from federal custody 3 hours ago on a technicality. Procedural error in evidence handling. The case was dismissed. Grace's blood turned to ice. What FBI is scrambling to refile charges, but it'll take weeks. In the meantime, Volkov is free. And based on intercepted communications, we believe he's flagged your Phoenix location. How did he? Doesn't matter. What matters is you're at risk. Relocation protocol is active. Pack one bag. You have 4 hours. A team will meet you at the safe house address we're texting now. My sister. Being contacted separately by FBI. She's covered under witness protection status. Jackson paused. Ms. Mitchell, Volkov holds grudges. You need to disappear tonight. The line went dead. Grace sat in her office, staring at her computer screen, at the foundation website, at the photos of people they'd helped. 2 years of work. 247 witnesses relocated. 3,000 legal consultations. All of it about to be abandoned because a Russian mobster had walked free on a technicality. Her phone buzzed. Text from Lillian. Emergency protocol. Don't panic. I'm packing now. We've done this before. Grace pulled out her wallet, found the business card with the single phone number. She'd carried it for 2 years without using it. She dialed. It rang once. Grace Winters. Dominic's voice unchanged by time. I was expecting this call. Volkov. I know. I have people in Phoenix. They'll extract you and Lillian within the hour. Safe house first, then we discuss permanent solutions. Dominic, I can't keep running. You won't have to. His voice carried the same controlled authority she remembered. Volkov made a mistake targeting you. It gives me legal standing to intervene. The FBI wants him back in custody. We make sure that happens. Did you think I'd let him threaten Sophie's safe lady? Despite everything, Grace smiled. Thank you. Thank me after we've handled this. Don't go inside your house until my people arrive. They're 2 minutes out. Grace hung up and texted Lillian. Help coming. Trust Dominic's team. The response was immediate. Always did. See you at safe house. Headlights appeared at the end of the street. A black SUV, familiar and frightening and somehow reassuring. Grace took a deep breath. She'd survived snow and zip ties and hypothermia. She'd survived kidnapping and gunfights and federal investigations. She'd built a foundation from trauma and helped hundreds of people find safety. She'd survived this too. The SUV pulled into her driveway. Jackson Reed sat in the driver's seat, older but recognizable. Ms. Mitchell, he said with a slight smile. Been a while. Dominic sends his regards. We're getting you somewhere safe. Grace stood, walked to the SUV, got in. As they pulled away from her house, she looked back once. The foundation office dark now, holding 2 years of purpose and progress, but not abandoned. Never abandoned. How long until Volkov's handled? Grace asked. Jackson glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Dominic's already working the problem. FBI's building a new case. Between his testimony and yours, Volkov won't stay free long. And in the meantime, you're under protection. Dominic's protection. Jackson's expression was serious. He doesn't forget debts, Ms. Mitchell. You helped Sophie find her voice. He won't let Volkov touch you. Grace closed her eyes, leaning back against the seat. 2 years ago, she'd been left to freeze in snow. Now, when danger returned, help came immediately. The machinery of Dominic Ashford's world, the empire he'd built and then legitimized, still protected her. And this time, Grace knew it wouldn't just be protection. It would be permanent resolution. The news broke on a crisp November morning. Grace was in a temporary apartment in Albuquerque, her third location in 3 months, when her phone buzzed with the alert. Russian crime boss sentenced to life for witness intimidation. She opened the article with shaking hands. Konstantin Volkov's face stared from the photo, older, grayer, defeated. The article detailed new federal charges: attempted murder of a federal witness, Grace, violation of witness protection statutes, conspiracy to obstruct justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Intercepted communications showing Volkov's orders to track Grace. Testimony from his own organization members who'd turned state's evidence. Financial records proving he'd funded the operation to locate her. And testimony from Dominic Ashford, whose immunity deals specifically required cooperation in cases involving witness intimidation. The judge had been unequivocal: life without parole. No appeals, no technicalities. Volkov was done. Grace set down her phone and stared out the window at Albuquerque's desert landscape. It was over. Actually over. The monster who'd orchestrated her sister's kidnapping, who'd tried to destroy Dominic, who'd threatened her new life, was permanently removed. She called Lillian first, then Jackson. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she dialed the number she'd called only twice before. Dominic answered on the second ring. "You saw the news. Life without parole. He threatened you, violated federal witness protection. The legal system doesn't take kindly to that." Dominic's voice was satisfied. "You're safe, Grace. Permanently this time. Because of you. Because you mattered enough to protect." A pause. "Sophie saw your foundation's website, asked if she could donate her allowance. I matched it. $50,000. It's being wired to Winter's Hope today." Grace's throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did. You built something remarkable from terrible circumstances. That deserves support." He cleared his throat. "The threat's gone. You can go home now. Back to Phoenix. Back to your work. Thank you, Dominic, for everything. Thank you for showing me that redemption is possible. Take care of yourself, Grace Mitchell." The line went dead. Grace sat alone in the Albuquerque apartment, processing the weight of what had just happened. Volkov was in prison for life. She could return to Phoenix. The foundation could resume. And Dominic Ashford, the man who'd saved her from snow and then saved her again from her enemies, was truly on the other side now. Legitimate, legal, using his power for protection instead of control. They'd both survived. They'd both transformed. And the snow that should have buried them had instead become the foundation of something neither could have imagined. The ballroom was modest by gala standards, a hotel conference room decorated with string lights and rented tables. But it was packed with 300 people who'd paid $75 each to attend Winter's Hope Foundation's 5th annual fundraiser. Grace moved through the crowd in a simple navy dress, accepting congratulations and thanking donors. The foundation had grown beyond her wildest expectations. In 5 years, they'd helped relocate 2,147 witnesses, provided legal representation for 3,612 more, created a network of safe houses and resources that spanned 8 states. The brass plaque from their first office was mounted on the wall now, alongside photos of people they'd helped. Faces blurred for privacy, but smiles genuine. Survivors who'd found safety. Lillian appeared at her elbow, elegant in a green dress that brought out the color in her cheeks. At 24, she was thriving full-time as the foundation's executive director. Healthy and vibrant in everything Grace had fought to preserve. "You okay?" Lillian asked. "Yeah," Grace smiled, "just thinking about how far we've come. From a diner in Winter to a gala in Phoenix." Lillian shook her head. "Sometimes it feels like a dream. A dream that started with a nightmare, but ended with hope." Lillian squeezed Grace's hand. "That's what you built, Grace. Hope for people who thought they'd run out." A volunteer approached, whispered something to Lillian. Lillian's eyes widened, then she smiled. "There's someone here who wants to meet you," Lillian said to Grace. "A major donor who flew in specifically for tonight." Grace followed Lillian to a quiet corner of the ballroom. A man stood there with his back to them, looking at the photo wall of success stories. He turned. Dominic Ashford, 5 years older but fundamentally unchanged. Still controlled, still precise, still carrying himself with the authority of someone who'd built empires. But his eyes were different, softer maybe, less haunted. "Grace," he extended his hand. "It's been a long time." Grace shook it, her heart pounding. "What are you doing here?" Sophie insisted. "She's 10 now, reads everything about the foundation, wanted to contribute." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. $100,000 for Winter's Hope, with her compliments and mine. Grace stared at the envelope. That's too much." "It's not nearly enough for what you've built." Dominic's expression was genuine. 2,000 lives saved, justice for victims, purpose from trauma. You did what I couldn't, turn darkness into light. You helped. I enabled. You executed. He looked around the gala at the donors and volunteers and survivors. "This is your legacy, Grace. Own it." Lillian diplomatically excused herself, leaving Grace and Dominic alone. "How's Sophie?" Grace asked. "Remarkable. Talks constantly now, top of her class, wants to be a lawyer, says she wants to help people like the safe lady did." Dominic smiled, and it transformed his face. "She still has your drawing on her wall, the one she made when she was 5. I'm glad she's thriving. Because of you. Because you showed both of us that safety exists, that trust is possible." Dominic's voice dropped. "I've built a legitimate empire now. Security consulting, port management, completely legal. But I learned the blueprint from you. Structure with compassion, control with care. You would have found your way. Maybe, but you accelerated it." He glanced at his watch. "I should go. Early flight tomorrow, but Grace..." He met her eyes. "Thank you. For surviving. For building this. For proving that people can change. We both changed. We both chose to." Dominic squeezed her hand briefly, then released it. "Keep fighting, Grace Mitchell. The world needs more people willing to stand in the cold for others." Then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Grace with an envelope that would fund another year of rescues. Grace stood at the window of Winter's Hope Foundation's expanded headquarters, looking out at Phoenix at sunset. Behind her desk, photos of the 147 witnesses they'd helped, articles about Volkov's life sentence, a framed drawing from Sophie, the same one from 5 years ago, gifted to Grace tonight with a note, "You'll always be my safe lady," and a letter received this morning that made everything worthwhile. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, you helped relocate my family 3 years ago when my husband testified against his employer's fraud. Because of your foundation, we're safe. My daughter just graduated high school. We have lives again. I was invisible once, just a secretary who heard too much. You taught me that being overlooked doesn't mean being powerless. Thank you for seeing us when we felt unseen. Maria Santos." Grace set the letter down and picked up her phone. She had a routine now. Every evening she read one success story, reminded herself why the foundation mattered. Tonight she also had something else. She opened her photo app, scrolled to the picture Lillian had taken at the gala. Grace and Dominic shaking hands, both smiling. 2 survivors who'd built new lives from frozen ground. The caption Lillian had added, "From snow to sunshine, 5 years of hope." Grace looked at the photo for a long moment, then archived it. Some chapters closed, some people saved you and then moved on. Some debts were repaid through living well, not through continued connection. Dominic had his legitimate empire. Sophie had her thriving childhood. Grace had her foundation. They'd all survived. They'd all transformed. And the snow that should have buried them had instead become the foundation, literally in Grace's case, of something remarkable. Grace returned to her desk. Lillian knocked and entered, holding quarterly reports. "We're up 30% in funding," Lillian announced, And we have 5 new partnership requests from other states, plus Dominic's donation puts us ahead of budget for the entire year. Grace looked at her sister, alive, healthy, purpose-driven, and felt the full weight of what they'd surveyed and built. "Let's help them all," Grace said. Outside, the sun set over Phoenix. No snow, no cold, just warmth and light and the promise of tomorrow. Grace Winters had been left to freeze in a February snowstorm. Grace Mitchell had risen from that ice and built a foundation that melted darkness for thousands. The waitress who'd been overlooked was gone. In her place stood a woman who made sure no one ever disappeared into the cold again. Lillian set down the reports and hugged Grace suddenly. "I'm proud of you. I'm proud of us. Mom and Dad would be too." Grace held her sister tight, thinking of parents lost too young, of a childhood stolen by tragedy, of 2 girls who'd survived through sheer determination and love. "We made it," Grace whispered. "Against every odd, we made it. And we'll keep making it," Lillian said. "One rescued person at a time." Grace pulled back, wiped her eyes, smiled. "One rescued person at a time." She looked out the window one last time. Somewhere in this city, someone was afraid. Someone was running. Someone was wondering if they'd survive the night. Tomorrow they'd call Winter's Hope, and Grace would answer, every single time.